Good afternoon. My name is Franca Palazzo, and I'm Vice President of Growth for iPolitics, and I volunteer as Executive Director of the Internet Society Canada chapter. I want to welcome you all to the third annual Digital Access Day. I think everyone will agree that this year, more than ever, internet access is extremely important, and the issues surrounding the digital divide are more important than ever. I'm really looking forward to the discussions that are going to take place over the next couple days, and I hope you'll stay with us throughout. And now I'd like to introduce Lynn Hamilton, President of the Internet Society Canada chapter, to say a few words.
Hi, everyone. So my job today is to thank all the wonderful people who make this possible. So our platinum sponsor today is the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, and they share research and resources on women entrepreneurs in Canada. They're made up of 10 regional hubs. They operate in both official languages and include a network of over 250 organizations, reaching more than 100,000 women entrepreneurs. They're part of the Government of Canada's Women Entrepreneurship Strategy that aims to increase women's entrepreneurship access to financing, talent, networks, and expertise. Using a methodology developed by the Boston Consulting Group and the Sherry Blair Foundation, it's estimated that by closing the gender gap in Canada, we could add anywhere from 41 to 81 billion to Canada's GDP. They are a fabulous organization, and we thank them for their generosity. I also want to mention our mothership, the Internet Society Global. They provide us with so much advice and leadership and support, and we're so grateful to be part of this global organization of internet thought leaders. CIRA, or .ca, is our founding sponsor and helped the chapter in our early days get started. Their seed money was pivotal to our success, and their ongoing support has been tremendous, so a big thank you to CIRA. And I can't forget iPolitics. They promote us, support us, and especially in these times when financial support is even harder to get, they have been a true and constant friend to the society. So thank you, iPolitics. And last but not least, there is Franca and Jeremy, who actually make all of the logistics and the meat and potatoes of putting the panels together and making the day actually happen. We are so lucky to have them. Thank you guys for everything that you do. And we look forward to a really, really productive couple days. And finally, now's the time that I ask all of you, if you care about a free and open internet that's accessible and affordable for all Canadians like I do, I urge you to become a member of our society. We'll send you reminders of all of our events and keep you up to date on all the things that are going on from a policy perspective with Canada's greatest internet thought leaders. We can't do this without you, and we could really use your individual support. That's it for me. Thanks again to everyone for participating today, and I look forward to an exciting agenda. Back to you, Franca.
Thank you, Lynn. So now I'd like to introduce the first panel of the day, probably the most important discussion we'll be having as it underpins every other issue we'll discuss, connectivity in Canada. The title is self-explanatory, so I'll jump right into introducing our moderator for that discussion, Tyson Johnson, who's the CEO and Director of Cyber New Brunswick. Tyson?
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thank you very much to Internet Society for inviting me to moderate this panel. To your point, there could be anything more timely for us to discuss in the days of the digital economy and COVID being the massive catalyst for identifying all the issues that we've known are there and have been there for a long, long time. And now it seems there's a political will and an industry will and a community will to move all things forward. So it's going to be a fascinating conversation today. With me today on the panel, Matthew Rantanen, Director of Technology, Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association, Sally Braun, General Manager, Western James Bay Telecom Network, and David Keith, Director of Business Development Operations at Lakeland Energy. So welcome to you all. And what we can do, we'll start with kind of an opening question, and as everyone volunteers their answer, maybe introduce yourself, talk a bit about your organization, and then we'll start with kind of a high-level conversation, and then we can dig down deeper from there. So Sally, we'll start with you, ladies first on the panel here today. So we're looking at issues around connectivity for all. Maybe walk us through, from the Western James Bay Telecom side. I know you've gone from what you say is diesel gens to fiber to the home. What are some of the biggest challenges you see, not in terms of, obviously you've had great success, but what's the next step? Where do we all need to get to? And I think, Sally, I think you're on mute.
Unmute. I have to say that I am extremely encouraged by what I'm hearing in terms of interest and funding. Like, it seems like the government is actually starting to listen to us. And I think that COVID-19 has been a big impetus for that. It's what you call a black swan event. It's something that none of us, well, maybe some of us might have imagined might come one day, but most of us hoped would not. We're in it now. And I have to say that I'm pretty pleased with how it's certainly helping our cause as First Nations to move ahead and finally get the attention of the government. I've always insisted to anyone that would listen that the internet was as important as hydro poles, electricity, roads. It's definitely a needed piece of infrastructure in any community, including First Nations community. So I think the challenges where we need to get to is the government is listening. That's good. For First Nations that are just embarking on this down this road, I guess the challenge is going to be that they know what are the correct questions to ask, the allies that they need to bring around them to support them, the importance of engaging the community, getting the community on side, and also developing a credible business case with the financial institutions. Those are the big hurdles that I see that
Thanks,
people
Sally.
have to get through.
Thanks, Sally. And we're going to dig deeper into those comments that you made here as the conversation goes on. Matthew, if I bring it to you now. So, south of the border, you've had the ability to achieve some great success there. And I know one of the areas that it's yes, there's been funds unlocked and we've heard the announcements, but it's how do you actually put it together and how do you bring this coalition to be successful? So maybe talk a bit about sustainability and what's the new business model we need to be looking at
Sure.
in terms of some of the experience that you've had.
So just a little background on me for a second, so you know where I'm coming from. I'm in my 20th year with the Southern California Tribal Chairmen's Association as the director of technology and kind of overarching technology decisions within 24 member tribes, helping them, look towards the future and make those assessments of where they need to be. I will echo what Sally said about COVID. Don't let a good emergency go to waste. This is the best illustration of why everyone needs broadband at their home, and it couldn't be more obvious after this. I have the honor to be co-chair of the Tech and Telecom subcommittee at the National Congress of American Indians, which is roughly 360 member tribes. So I work with a lot of tribes here and work on a lot of different business plans and opportunities and thought process around this. And then I advise our Western Governors Association, which is essentially, the west half of the United States and some of the islands, on broadband development, rural development, as well as tribal, and then the state of California as well. So I come from a policy space, having served also 2 terms on the Native Nations Broadband Task Force at our Federal Communications Commission in the past. So I kind of have this I don't know, I've been running around this space for a while. And from that perspective, we've seen tribes and First Nations go from a grant to grant thought process. And, that's not a sustainable future. There's no guarantees that you're going to get next grant. There's no guarantees you're going to payroll if you play that game. We've been working early on for alignment with government subsidies as a step into a partial sustainability model, or taking away some of that overhead. And then somebody has to pay for services. When you get down to it, somebody has to pay for services. And I'll tell you, in all the years that we've provided free services to certain entities within our tribal communities, we get way more value from the customer once they become a pay customer. They respect the value professionally, as if it were a service like their telephone or a service like their electric bill. They respect it. They have a better professional interaction. They're not as critical of the service as far as, oh, well, you know, yeah, it's free, so, you know, it's probably not that good. But as soon as they start paying for it, then they equate the dollar value that they're paying to what they're actually getting, and they're more responsible about the usage of that and understanding of what that means. So those are some of the things that, you know, we're trying to refresh or educate into the thought process of building out, you know, the proper business ecosystem to be able to carry a communications company in a community forward. You know, getting your head around the fact that, you know, this is as important as water and an electricity and a roof is tough. I mean, you know, you can sleep under a roof, and if you got a glass of water, I mean, you know, you can live, but is that living? And is that living today? And is that being relevant today in today's ecosystem, the greater ecosystem? And that's, I think, what tribes are trying to figure out how to be, is relevant in today's society. And especially with some of the crazy voting and stuff that's going on, and being, you know, participating in the overarching decisions that affect them on a daily basis from, you know, from on high. I think that they are now understanding that they must figure out a way to carry this forward and become, you know, it becomes the fourth leg of the stool, so that you're more stable in your future building. And so I really think that the new model gets subsidized by the tribe's other efforts, gets subsidized by whatever you can get your hands on federal government. It gets influxes of capital expenditure for equipment and things and donations, but ultimately you have to build some sort of a platform where that basis will live in perpetuity.
Thanks, Matthew. So David, if we look up to Lakeland Networks and the work that you're doing, you know, look at it from the perspective of how you engage communities and municipalities, and are you seeing a change in the business model, or and how are you from your perspective working with the communities to put together these types of programs?
Sure, we've, like everybody else, seen massive changes through COVID. Muskoka predominantly being, you know, 2/3 permanent residents and a third that are seasonal residents, have seen those seasonal people either become permanent or at least act as permanent. Living in a very rough terrain area of hills, woods, lakes, with extremely inadequate internet services in most of those recreational type areas. The demand we've seen extreme demand in the increase for higher quality services, and a very hard to deliver type area. Lakeland Energy, who I work for and run the company for, we do, our retail brand is Lakeland Networks. We're owned by Lakeland Holdings. We're owned by 6 municipalities that operate as a private company. Those municipalities include Bracebridge, Huntsville, Perry Sound, Burke Falls, Sundridge, and Magnetawan. We're an extremely aggressive company in the sense that we cut through a lot of red tape to get to the solutions. We were predominantly a fiber-based company in Muskoka up until April 1st this year, and I may sound silly in the middle of COVID, but we made an acquisition of a wireless broadband company with over 120 points of presence, predominantly mostly being towers, either owned or leased on owned land or leased land, because it's sort of the infrastructure that feeds this market extremely well. Our challenges going forward, whether it be with government funding or not, hopefully with government funding, all that's available this year, is moving a lot of those speeds to that 50 by 10 service for acceptable use, because we have so many residents that are in the marketplace that are now working from home require higher upload speeds to work effectively in an environment where working with a typical old what used to be the industry standard of a DSL connection, a 6 meg over 1, and you only got that if you were close to the central office. It just does not even meet the applications required even for what we're doing today in a Zoom type application. And that's where we're trending towards. Like everybody else has mentioned here, COVID has been one of those backward blessings. Our fiber business has sort of gone through the roof this year with growth. The wireless being new through the acquisition, we are trending in the last quarter of the year with substantial infrastructure growth. We've been on top of all of the funding that's out there, from CRTC to ICON to individual projects, as well as obviously now the UBF fund. We had some people attend the call today to see what announcements were made, and we're very interested on getting on the rapid release program for as many as we can get built for November of 2021. There is a need out there. It's dire. We are considered a small company, I guess, in perspective of a lot of others, where we've got a total of about 6,000, just over 6,000 customers. We run about 500 kilometers of fiber optic. But in Muskoka, we do have a very strong, Muskoka Parry Sound, should I say, we have an extremely strong presence. That being said, there's probably still 75% plus of the market that are underserved.
Well, and so, Sally, I'm going to come back to you in a second, and just want to build on some of the conversations that have been starting here right now. Is, you know, we've seen, so Cyber, when we were at Crown Corp, before we became a not-for-profit, we actually managed the broadband projects here in the province. And one of the things that we continually bumped into, and I'm sure it's going to be no secret to anyone here, is we bump into issues of, okay, great, we're going to do a broadband strategy. Okay, great, we're going to go wireless. And now it's a question of, where do you put it first, second, third? You know, you get pushback from the traditional owners of these technologies saying, we're looking for population density and how many homes can we sell to. Rural and Indigenous First Nations communities don't really qualify because, you know, there's not a lot of density there, and, you know, can't really sell a lot. So Sally, I know we want to talk about kind of breaking the kind of traditional business models and looking at, you know, how do we bring forward something that's more innovative than the traditional legacy for-profit models. What are your thoughts there?
Well, actually, the business model that I am thinking of is actually a very, very old business model that I think needs to be brought forward and made new again. And I always think of, I always talk about how the railroads were built and how the education system was built in Canada. And the railroad was brought to the community. The education system was brought to the child, regardless of where they lived. And I sat in on that call with Miriam Monsef an hour ago, and I was very encouraged to see that this seems to be the direction that the government is heading in. They recognize that not every community is going to get internet based on a for-profit business case. So I'm extremely heartened to see that, you know, smaller builds that are based on community networks look like they're going to get the attention that they deserve. I think in the past, and I'll just touch on it briefly, I think in the past there's been a what I call an adversarial divide, and it is not of anyone's making. It's just the way things are, in that for-profit companies have a certain set of regulations that they need to adhere to, and not-for-profit companies have a completely different raison d'etre. So I think that whatever we can do to support small Indigenous community networks, rural community networks, I think we all need to help each other on that score. And if we need to partner with a for-profit company, maybe look to the smaller players rather than the larger ones. Well,
and so on that note, I'll make this one kind of a jump ball, and I'm going to guess all three of you are going to want to weigh in here. So on hearing and we're seeing it here in the province of New Brunswick as well, things like how do you become a non-dominant carrier? How do you leverage pole access? How do you create the capability for a sustainable ISP that's, inside an Indigenous community, so that not only do they have access and capabilities, but they can actually manage their own infrastructure, not have to pay the crazy sums of money they're paying for support calls or maintenance costs and other types of things. So the idea that we kind of look at this through a different lens, and I think the time is right for the federal government to come in on this, because not far off our heels are very disruptive things like Starlink, which are going to bring high speed to the home, doesn't matter where you live, and we'll all be paying Elon Musk $100 a month. So with that as the backdrop of what's coming, where innovation is going, what do you see in terms of issues like access to spectrum, access to poles? Do you see that as something that will be a federal initiative, and where even the large players in telecoms will need to find a way to position and play with the communities? Matthew, do you want to start maybe? And is that a potential reality? Obviously, south of the border, you have more telecoms carriers than we do. North of the border, we're kind of limited with who we have to deal with. But what do you see south of the border?
Yeah, so in the lower 48, we have issue with the telecom providers that are there. A lot of them are legacy DSL systems that they're not reinvesting in their network. So the future growth or expansion or connectivity to that is a backward step for everybody. And when we have a third world problem, we want a first world solution, right? We don't want to take the steps of telecom over the last 25 years. We don't want to walk through history before we get to today. We want to get to today as our first solution. So that's a battle, and it's a battle to try to get a telecom or an existing provider to be able to see that as reality for them. I'll leave the poll question to Sally because I know her struggles with that, but I do believe that at least in California, the Public Utilities Commission is leaning really heavy on the pole owners to be able to allow co-location. And it's co-location at minimal fee, or if fee at all, or some sort of just a maintenance upgrade, or if you have to hang something that's heavier than the pole's rated at, you replace the pole. But it's that kind of a relationship that needs to be built. It can't be like, ooh, we're going to fleece these people that want to be on our poles, because that is infrastructure that is already there and could really lower the cost to get into that. And just to touch a bit on Starlink and some of the low Earth orbit opportunities that are coming up in the states, the programs that I'm working with at the federal level and some of the state levels don't accept Starlink as a solution for broadband, because it is technically more like cell service, right? And mobile service. It isn't a solution that comes down and can wire your home up with internet at the moment. There will be probably some innovative uses of that where you can bring it into the household and share it through routing systems. I'm sure you can do that now to get creative, but it's not designed that way yet. And we'll see an evolution of that. We'll also see a price drop as they start to saturate and cover some cost. They will become competitive with themselves. If we get a second provider in the air, we have a much better marketplace and a much more creativity than just being beholden to Elon, which we all are anyway, right? Thanks.
Sally, do you want to step in there on the pole access piece and maybe some of the areas around non-dominant carriers?
As far as the pole access goes, it's I believe in negotiation, and I know in Ontario they doubled the pole access fees. I guess in the fall of 2018. Western James Bay, I mean, we're extremely fortunate because the entity that owns the poles in the communities we serve are First Nations communities. So they're willing to ease the fees in for us, which is, we're thankful for that. But for communities, there's two things that can be done. One, more energy transmission projects should be owned by First Nations rather than the larger companies. And as long as and that way they can maybe, they can set their fees, because they would be able to do that under their treaty rights. And I guess the other thing about the just quickly, as far as Starlink goes, I'm not 100% sure that Starlink is actually going to work at all latitudes. I'm still waiting to get some more documentation on that area.
Yeah, that's correct, Sally. They won't be up in Canada yet. I've got confirmation on that, actually.
Well, I've heard that they won't operate north of the 52nd parallel because of the curvature of the Earth, but that I'm just waiting to get some confirmation about that. But if Starlink did come in, I mean, we always are going to need a backup. We always need redundancy and path diversity, which is something that we don't have right now with Western James Bay and 2 of our communities. So I'm willing to look at Starlink as a backup if it ever gets to us. But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about those items, Tyson.
Tyson, there's a little bit of an update on OneWeb as well. It seems that OneWeb has kind of been pulled out of the hopper and possibly refunded, and it might be as early as a month from now, it become back online and a viable solution as a competitor in that space. And I was talking with Mark Buell, and Mark was saying that they are planning on operating above the 60th parallel. So there may be an opportunity in Canada that Starlink won't provide, and that may be OneWeb.
Super. And I know obviously we have Xplornet here north of the border too, and to see increases in their coverage would certainly be welcomed by many. David, pole access, I know something, Bobby, you know a lot about with what you guys are up to.
Yeah, we're obviously, our sister company is a hydro company, but that doesn't, with regulation, buy us any special rights to the poles. This year, we actually ran into an experience where we were building out in Sundridge, Ontario. We were building out to about 500 households. Budget for us, capital expenditure investment was about $250K. When going through to actually planning the project in the early aspects of this fiscal, we were advised that it was going to cost us, with pole replacements, over $1 million to roll this project out. It delayed our project for 6 months. We found other ways to do it, mostly underground, which is more costly for us, better long-term, but more costly for us to roll out. But it did delay the project at least 6 months. This is not a non-common occurrence that we run into, or anybody in the ISP industry runs into. But it is a huge headache, because it just seems, I mean, obviously at the end of the day, we don't want to be spending $1 million to replace poles to put a strand of fiber on it. There's just no logic in that. We need some other group, some other party to really take a look at this and address these concerns. Since we acquisitioned our wireless partner, we've become a part of CanWIS, which is the Canadian Association of Wireless Internet Service Providers. With that, we have a greater voice with government, the CRTC, and other bodies. And we are lobbying a lot of individuals regarding trying to make changes and joining other groups regarding that. But it is a headache. It is taken into consideration. But outside of even poles, when you're building out networks, even on the side of building towers, nobody wants to look at unsightly towers, but they want the broadband. Leasing the land is another issue. Getting hydro to the land where we're not running solar panels is extremely expensive. If communities could work easier with us regarding leasing agreements, their expectations. I've seen leasing agreements for towers go from 2 pages to 12 pages in the last 10 years, where you need 3 lawyers to decipher the document to put something on top of, to build a tower or to be on top of a water tower or whatever it may be. it's like the communities have that dire need for broadband, but are putting more roadblocks in the way for the ISPs, and that's small and large, to be able to build out their network, which we run into on a regular basis. Or we're sitting where we're getting tied up in counselor meetings trying to get our point across, only to be declined at the end of the day, when the initiative 9 times out of 10 is being driven by their own constituents and the customer base in that area. And at this point in time, it's becoming, it's slowing us down drastically. I would say probably we're looking at about a 3 to 8 month now backlog on projects that we had planned, and we were financially covering ourselves without funding due to these delays. Just doesn't make any sense in the marketplace today. And a lot of people, some of these people are actually putting these things on hold based on the hype built around Starlink, that it's going to be here tomorrow and providing a service, with not really being educated or realizing what that service is going to provide. It's a great service. It does feed those outer markets where there's a less populated area. It's great for that. It does complement the XploreNet offerings in Canada. You've also got Telesat in the Canadian marketplace that's been funded to provide literally the same type of solution in the Canadian marketplace. But I don't think people are realizing the timelines. There's no education out there other than the hype. Again, I'll use Starlink as the example there. There's tons of hype about that every day in the news. And now I've got municipalities that are asking me to respond and to actually counter the situation of Starlink before they go through with an approval of us putting a solution in the marketplace, not realizing that in the Canadian marketplace, for a multitude of things, from regulations, lower orbit satellites, speeds, testing, we're only seeing the good news that's out there, not the negative test trials that are going through, that this is probably, at least in the Canadian market, at least 5 years out.
Yeah, I think I feel guilty, and I take back having mentioned the phrase Starlink earlier, but you know, but
Fact of life.
But you know, it's a great example of how we have to put the attention on the right things. And so I think you know, the next question goes to, how do we drive community engagement? So is there a secret recipe? And I can tell you from our experience, we're working a project right now on agile learning across the Indigenous communities here in the province of New Brunswick. And we kind of come out of the review of all the communities, and there's a bit of a list of priority by a number of factors, but one of them is about like which communities want to get engaged the quickest, which ones are most actually keen to do this. But there's also some ownership back on our side, which says, how are we showing a value add? How is there a value proposition to this? And how do we kind of break the conversation, break that cycle of what they might have heard from the traditional business model? So is there a community engagement secret recipe here?
On my side, I can't say I've learned it yet. I think there's a lot of, especially the awkwardness at this point in time is with COVID. It's not like I can set up in community centers and talk to people or do door-to-door campaigns educationally. I'm going back to a lot of grassroots marketing for education to get to people. You've got obviously social media opportunities, but you know, everything's got a price tag. We're trying to deliver a service, and now we've got to look at a budget to educate the marketplace on top of delivering that service, which I believe should come from a higher level of, you know, whether it be federal or provincial government. There needs to be more of an awareness created out there. And again, whether it be the education on that, the roadblocks that ISPs having to get to the market. We have customers on a daily basis saying, asking us questions and just do not understand why we can't come another kilometer down the road. It could be a multitude for different reasons. And the people that are trying to provide it, whether it be profit or not for profit, are the ones that are actually blamed for not getting the service to the customer when we're roadblocked by things that stand 100% out of our control.
I do have a secret recipe for this.
Good.
It's the lowest common denominator, and it's the kids. Everything revolves around the kids. every tribal community that I've ever worked with, the focus is 7 generations out, if they still are very traditional in their beliefs, and the bettering their community and bettering the opportunities for their children is the primary driver. So if you can engage the education department leadership, the tribal cultural engagement leadership, teachers and people that are there, and then that you can educate the elders that are maybe more traditional, that don't understand technology or don't understand technology's place, to understand that their children are seeking an education and a place in life that may take them away from the reservation or the reserve to go to higher learning. And they may come home with a degree that requires them to have access. If they don't have access in their community, they're not coming back home. They might come home to visit, but they're not coming home to live. So your community loses a big chunk of its brain trust and of its cultural trust. And so you're not getting that back. If you build the opportunity for them to live and thrive in your community, in their community, then they will stay home and operate from home. Otherwise, you've lost a key component of your whole community.
Sally, did you want to weigh in there?
Yeah, Tyson, we're really fortunate because we spent years engaging with our communities and explaining the benefits of having better internet. Actually, we didn't really have to do that much because people, they really want it. But a large part of my job, and I agree with David, is managing expectations. I mean, I'm fielding calls every day, emails from people saying, well, when is this going to happen? When is this going to happen? Our project was supposed to go live next month, but because of COVID, we had to delay it by a year. But what Matthew says is extremely important, because that was another lever that we used. And we're already seeing young professionals coming back to our communities with their degrees based on the promise that this is coming. So it's extremely important to have your community on board. And, if you're going for funding, if you're meeting with the government, make sure you have your elders with you. Make sure you have your leadership in the room when you're sitting down with the funders, with the banks, with the other stakeholders. That's really important. Just approach it. The entire community has to be on your side of the fence.
And I'd echo on the education side. One of the projects that we've been working on here at CyberNB is around, so we do a lot of work around K-12 cybersecurity education and training and putting curriculum into schools. We actually helped launch a cohort here with Indigenous communities and industry and education. And one of the challenges now is, so you have these phenomenal cohorts of Indigenous youth who are coming out through this one program. But if they can't, like most cybersecurity professionals these days, depending on what you work in, you're able to work from home as long as you have high-speed internet. You can VPN in and you can work from home, and you can have that, average $80,000 a year job working from home, and then investing those dollars in the communities that you live in, because that's where you are, that's where you're located. And so the challenge is that there's a big disconnect between, okay, great, there's a phenomenal education opportunity, but don't forget, they have to be able to then operate from within their communities. Otherwise, they're all exported. They're all that talent is sitting in urban centers. And so we've missed the boat if we're not connecting the need for infrastructure in the communities or in rural areas to ensure that, like, this is the greatest economic development opportunity that we're facing with right now. But we have to connect the two dots. And so I couldn't agree more. Education is probably the right anchor to get in and to build. But then we have to, I think, build an awareness around the infrastructure as well. It's all great to have the curriculum and have the programs, but if you can't operate from those locations, then all you're doing is creating phenomenal talent to be traveling elsewhere. And I don't think that's the ultimate goal here. And then I guess the next question that I would ask the panel is then, okay, and in Sally, I know in some of the pre-materials we were going back and forth with, we talked about kind of transformation over 20 years. And it's phenomenal, but I don't know if we have 20 years. I don't know if the next generation, I don't know if we have a 10-year window or 20-year window to get somewhere. And so the Black Swan event, this COVID that has, shine a light on what we should have known was there all along. How do we accelerate this? Who has to be at the table to accelerate this?
I think that's happening now, Tyson. I saw many tables formed, especially in my province in Ontario, tables where, the Ministry of Health was sitting down with the Indigenous leaders. The Minister of Infrastructure was sitting at the table. The Attorney General was at the table. All those departments, it looks like they are working together, and that is very promising, in my view, to see engagement at that level. But one of the things that I did notice over the course of the summer, and hopefully, my company and a few others have been able to correct it, is that the leadership, unfortunately, were making decisions and they didn't have the right information, in the sense that they didn't understand that in order for this decision to be expedited, the technology needed to be in place. We ran into it with the schools in our communities where they wanted to launch certain platforms and simply weren't able to do it. But so we had to work with people on that. But I just wanted to jump back to one thing, Tyson, you were saying about the young professionals coming back. A lot of times they're prevented from coming back because they don't have the housing in the communities. But what I'm finding is that when they do come back, they can afford to build off reserve, but near where their reserve is. And some of them, that's exactly what they're doing because they can afford it.
Right.
I don't think there's ever been a greater time that people have wanted to get out of the major urban centers and get back more to remote areas or home roots. They went to the urban centers to make the jobs, use their education, and so on. And the only roadblock for a lot of them is being able to, as you mentioned, that $80,000 job, is have that virtual office where they've got a decent broadband connection and they can work anywhere and they can probably live and maximize their life in an environment that they want it from the get-go, but they've actually had to move away to make a career. And I'm seeing that major here, and I'm sure everybody else has reflected on that. So I think we're going to see a massive change from urban centers and people looking to make those changes. But high at the end of the list is they need that broadband connection.
Yeah, and to Sally's point, sorry, Matthew, do you want to jump in?
No, I was just going to add in a little bit that one of the dynamics that we're seeing in the lower 48, and I'm sure it's happening above the border as well, is that, major corporations, I'm just going to give an example of Twitter, where they announced that all of their workforce can work from home, right? 100% of their workforce can work from home. They're dumping brick and mortar responsibilities and costs for their company. They are also then, you watch the mass exodus from the Bay Area of all the Twitter folks because they can't afford that housing anyway, but they're there because they needed to be there. Now they don't need to be there. So boom, they go home or they go to some rural community where they'd rather be. The knowledge and expertise that is now in some of those rural communities in a situation where they're like, oh, our bandwidth opportunities here are a little limited. Let's see if we can leverage some of our friends in the industry to start changing that ecosystem and growing the rural opportunity. I think we're going to have a shift because the knowledge base has moved into the space without access.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a couple, I want to follow up on one of these areas that we just talked about because something came up during the conversation. Then I want to go to a whole different area. But so if kids and education is the way in, where does digital health rank? So we have these phenomenal paths forward in digital healthcare where we can leverage technology to allow people to live at home longer, to receive more proactive and better care, quicker, faster, to put less of a burden on hospitals and the healthcare system in general. Have there been any movements that you've seen in this area when it comes to good examples of where advanced or increased access to technology and broadband will help with healthcare outcomes?
I'll just tag on to that thing I just said. It's the same for that same group, right? So they're knowledgeable about healthcare and the current standards of healthcare because they've come from one of the most elite spaces in industry that probably has incredible healthcare. They're moving to a rural community where they are removed from some of those healthcare facilities. Now that becomes a play in their thought process of like, how do I get back to that great doctor that I had when I was in the Bay Area? Now that I'm living in the middle of Nebraska, you know, how do I make that connection? How do I increase telehealth? And it really plays on the retirement community that does live rural, that is coming out of the tech industry, which over the last 20 years, there's been a handful of folks in that space. I think the knowledge base in the rural space around what you're talking about has increased. So there are active movements, or at least when somebody does open up an opportunity to come to a region, they will have more allies in the process because of that.
David or Sally, did you want to jump in on the digital health question?
Tyson, we've seen massive improvements in our region on the health file. We, Western James Bay, before we launched, we got into the fiber to the home piece, which hasn't been deployed yet. We provide fiber optic connectivity to 55 anchor institutions on the James Bay coast. And by providing that bandwidth to the hospitals, people don't, right now, most people have to fly to Kingston for care, to get an MRI, to get an X-ray, to get a retinal scan. So, but now with fiber, they don't have to fly for the eye exam. It can be done. It can be done digitally. X-ray, same thing. They can have their X-ray done by a technician in Attawapiskat, and then that information can be transferred and to the radiologist in Timmins. So all these things are, the government is actually saving money by investing in an ISP like Western James Bay.
Yeah, on the health side of things, most of the communities up here are fine. I think the biggest thing that we've run into, and it's not actually on the ability to provide the bandwidth. I think they've got all those tools available based where I am. It's more so the impact of the population, the seasonal population growing massively because of COVID. We don't have the people and the services available. And initially they asked people to sort of stay in the places that were their permanent residence. And a lot of people didn't abide by that. So when you see an extra 25, 30,000 people show up that aren't expected to be there, it really affects the medical systems that are in place. On the educational side of things, for the last few years with the initiative by the government to put in the 1 meg per student program, where fiber was available to be able to deliver those. There's been a lot of schools that are more, I've been put in a better place. My concern isn't so much on the schooling side in the actual environments of the actual educational institutions. It's when the people go home and don't have the same internet access that they may have with students that they're going to school with. Where somebody goes home to a fiber connection and somebody goes home to a 1 meg connection and are expected to complete the same type of assignments or do virtual learning now with COVID. It's a very distinct divide in the opportunities for the students to learn today. And I think that's the biggest issue that needs to be addressed. And you will find the parents, as Matthew had mentioned earlier, that the children in the marketplace are probably the people that can lead us to the changes that need to happen, because I don't think parents traditionally are shy of spending money to better the life for their children.
Yeah, I think the tricky piece then is infrastructure before personal technology. And so we're seeing that here on the Agile Learning Initiative we're running in New Brunswick. Is, they went out and created a phenomenal program so that every kid could go out and get a laptop that wasn't able to get one. Well, that's wonderful until you get back to your house and you have no internet access. You're being asked to work on a kind of integrated learning platform where you're accessing virtual servers to run simulations, and that you can't even participate. It doesn't even load. So infrastructure first before the shiny laptop. Now, there's been some interesting initiatives. Well, there's one that we're hearing of in the US called Agile Fractile Grid, and they're building, micro grids, and they're taking telecommunications and utilities and everything, and they're bundling it together to create dynamic opportunities for regions or townships or cooperatives to be able to build their own capabilities, if you will. And that's kind of a public-private partnership where the investment dollars come in and then it pays itself back over a number of years. Are we seeing these types of innovations or these types of innovative funding strategies, partnership strategies as something that we want to consider in the long term, or do we think we have the right players and the right ideas at the table today?
Tyson, are you talking about a mesh network?
It'd be like a mesh network, exactly. And then it would leverage, like to what you were saying, Sally, around railroads. It's actually fascinating is the railroads are easier to get pole access to in the States sometimes because they're not owned by any one group. And so it's, if you happen to be near railroad infrastructure, you might be able to bring more technology faster, quicker. So these are kind of these hacks, if you will, of how to build faster, quicker around some bulky legislation or industry constructs. Are we seeing similar things?
We're going to be, Western James Bay is actually, we're going to be working with our youth in each community, and we're going to be using mesh system as an emergency backup, and it'll be run by the youth. And it's the model we're using was put forward by a group called Libra Mesh, and so we're going to be looking at that for our 3 communities, and it'll be emergency backup system run by the youth in the community.
And it's emergency backup because it has not as much capacity. Is that right, Sally?
It runs on batteries, and you're correct. It doesn't have a large capacity,
right,
but it does have the capacity for example, if there's an emergency situation and the internet is down, it does have the capacity that people can get messages to other people in the community.
Right. So one of the things that we're seeing, and I've been on the fringe of this Smart America kind of a movement, smart grid. Arizona State University is doing a lot of this with some of their planning groups and their CIO and the president's office of the university. But I think where it becomes crazy when you get out to the reservations in the really rural areas is that a lot of the components of what they do for a smart grid are gone. Density of communications, density of fiber, density of so fiber for backhaul, and then density of access to power itself. So there's some missing links, and how do you integrate like maybe green power and things like that to be able to change the Lego pieces to make the same model or similar model. So there's a lot of thought process around that. I don't think that they've come up with any like here's solutions 1 through 5 and pick one and whichever fits you. But we do see a lot of things in the space of communications around emergency. So FirstNet, as some of you may know, is launching throughout the United States. AT&T won the contract for the federal basically emergency data network. And they're using existing AT&T infrastructure, but they're past the point of, okay, all the low-hanging fruit, the AT&T infrastructure is there, now we have to build out. So now I think they're looking for, partners and opportunities and everything that they see that's being built. How do we tie into that? How do we become part of that? So we see, like in the town that's closest to me, I've seen them change all the tops of like every 3rd light pole in the town. And if you look at it, it's essentially an omni antenna hidden in a piece of plastic, and it's a communications mesh network. It's not for the community to use, but it is for community services. So, it's like utilities departments and first responders and such, and the city management. So I'm wondering if we're getting to a point where that will evolve capacity wise to be able to be a solution also for like a municipal network to serve people as they move through that city.
Now, the other topic of interest is around spectrum, and in Canada, that's been a major topic of conversation. Spectrum is usually, a bidding war and usually goes to the top bidders. what do we do here? How do we change the dynamic here? How do we ensure that, like for example, I've heard some interesting concepts around, if rural and indigenous communities came together, they could actually form their own pan-Canadian network. If they had a spectrum to play in, they could actually support each other. Like, what do we need to do to change the conversation on spectrum? And maybe Matthew, to start south of the border again, have you seen any revelations down there that we might want to model up north of the border?
Yeah, we've actually been instrumental. I was involved early on in what they call the tribal priority window, or tribal priority for spectrum at the Federal Communications Commission. And this would be something that would be great to adopt north of the border, if not a different solution. So even a more evolved solution of that. Initially, the plan was that if there was going to be a spectrum auction in the United States, that the spectrum over tribal land would be an opt-out process. The tribe would get licensed to that over their land, and then they had to opt out if they didn't want it. What it turned into, and the first use of it was for FM radio, was the ability to apply for a radio station to get priority if there's any competition without fee over your tribal land to serve your land with FM radio station. We were able to apply that now for the first time for the use of broadband, and that was the 2.5 gigahertz, which is an educational broadcast spectrum in the United States that was basically allocated to university and higher education, and it was either misused or not used. So the FCC did a land grab and got it all back, at least the stuff that wasn't in actual use. And then they were going to auction it off because they're looking at billions of dollars of revenue for the US government for this. But we were able to apply that tribal priority pre-auction. Those that wanted to apply for it could apply for it. Now, we did not get the opt-out again, which we would much rather have. That, okay, tribes, you have this over your land, opt out if you don't want it or don't want to manage it. And here's the build out requirements. But it was an opt-in process, an application process. And so we just yesterday, they announced that we're right around 214 of those applications are complete and are in the process for, getting the license applied. There are another 200 applications ish that have some sort of a waiver attempt and some sort of a, hey, can we serve the community next to our tribal community because that's where our people actually live, kind of a thing. And those are being sorted out at the FCC. Those are not likely to be applied. But if there was a process where we could convince leadership that those spectrum rights should be allocated to the tribes that aren't already allocated for commercial purposes and on the hook for some dollars, that all spectrum availability should be an opportunity for tribes to be able to serve their own communities moving forward without fee, without monetary restrictions there. And that way, though those resources should probably be the tribes' resources anyway, as the United States and as Canada were formed and the resources were grabbed by the existing governments, they are not structured that way. So it might be the best interim step is to get, every time something comes available, the tribe has an opt-out process to not want to manage that asset moving forward. But should they choose to stay opted in, then they have a resource, like you said, to be able to pull this off. That would be one of the best methods.
Well, and I don't know, David, Sally, so if high-speed internet becomes a basic human right, if you will, going forward, to be able to participate in the digital economy, should spectrum be held for ransom and go to the highest bidder?
No, I don't think so. I don't agree with that at all. There's sort of some reading that I've been doing lately, and I'm not an expert on this subject by any means, but the whole aspect of spectrum sovereignty. And in Northern Ontario, for example, like 2/3 of the landmass is the traditional territory of about 49 First Nations. So, and here we have some large for-profit players that have the ownership of the spectrum. I mean, this was not done by any First Nations choice or permission. It's something that the government holds these licenses and can allocate them under a process that First Nations people never signed on to. But the problem I have is when the rights to the companies that have rights to the spectrum don't exercise those rights, don't provide the services that one would expect a company to provide. And the response that we tend to get is, oh, it's too expensive. But I think if a large company isn't going to use the spectrum, then it should be sublet or put back into the government's hands so that the smaller players can access it. That would be my view.
It's an extremely difficult world. I'm learning more about it since we obviously made the acquisition of a wireless company. With the spectrum auctions coming up, early next year. From a financial perspective, competing against the large enterprise telcos across the country who have a heck of a lot deeper pockets than us, we need just the deposits of 20,000 plus per frequency that we're applying for. So if we want to look at, 6 frequencies, there's 120,000 we need to put out just to enter the game. On top of that, we're not bidding experts by any form of the imagination, do not have the human resources available. So we need to outsource to somebody that can do this. And that doesn't mean anybody on the block. We need somebody that's actually got expertise and success in this marketplace, which means paying a higher price to try and get that consultant to lock themselves away for a month or two, or however long the bidding process takes, to be able to secure those areas of spectrum that we're looking for. It's, my eye opener to this. It's a ridiculous process, especially as, Sally was mentioning, there's unused frequencies out there owned by companies. It's the process that I've seen to get there, and the way the spectrum is managed right now totally needs an overhaul to make it fair for, everybody across to make it a real level playing field, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah, I guess the point would be, if spectrum auctions were created back in the day before the internet was a mandatory requirement for the future of the digital economy, maybe we need to rethink it. Matthew?
Yeah, so one of the things that we tried to do in policymaking here when I was at the Native Nations Broadband Task Force, and now still through the National Congress of American Indians, we're still pushing this button, is to force carriers that hold spectrum over tribal lands or over a region that aren't using them, that are kind of stockpiling them, or hoarding, we like to say, to force a secondary market use, right? So a secondary market license where they have to offer that up at a fair market value for somebody else to be able to deploy using that spectrum in the space that they're not intending to build out on. That has gotten the most pushback from every lobbyist in the United States working for those corporations. And, they have billions of dollars behind the effort to make sure that they hang on to those assets, because, at some point they probably paid, $100 million for a license that incorporated the tribes that were in San Diego County, right? But the San Diego proper and North County cities are their bread and butter, and they don't really care about the mountains and the valleys out in the base of the mountains where the tribes have been pushed to, but they still hold the license. So we've fought that a few times, and they don't, well, first of all, they don't believe that tribes understand what they're doing to be able to actually manage the spectrum. And second of all, they are hoarding that for future use. I get it, you paid for it, and there might be a change in technology where you need to, grow into that capacity space for some reason or another. But, there should be a way to, especially if there's, 20 years of no use in a spectrum space, there's got to be a way where we can force their hand to either invest in it or not, and then let it go. Even if they hold the ownership of it and lease it to us, at least there'd be an opportunity to put it to use, because some of the sweetest spectrum that'll go through trees, bounce off rocks, and go around corners is held. It's like when the automobile manufacturers bought all the electric car patents and put them on a shelf, right? Yeah. You're going to see the innovation in an industry and the innovation in a region die because somebody else just wants to hang on to the opportunity if they feel so inclined.
And
I
that,
think,
that's,
yeah.
go ahead,
Okay.
Sally.
Oh, I was just going to say, I think in the case of Northern Ontario, I mean, uh, I think there's a specific non-performance argument to be made here, where the communities are actually being held back because of the players that own the spectrum and that aren't doing anything with it. So this guy's got 20 cars in his garage, and I don't have any. And I think that's, there needs to be, I think David is right. I think we need to take a real long look. And I think the CRTC is actually looking for guidance in this area.
So I know we're blasting through the time here. I think for people who are listening, if you have questions, please bring them forward here very, very soon, so we can start to get to them. David, so COVID, what are we, maybe a year away from some type of return to normal if we think about this? What's it been like in terms of service support implementation as a deliverer of services and support here?
Been a different marketplace. Initially, we shut down for about a 30-day span. Couldn't do any installs. Had to figure out how to handle this. There's companies out there, the major players in the game, that are still doing self-installs and not doing home installs. We decided it's more costly, but do a lot of research. Our installers wear full PPE gear. I'm basically talking about a plastic suit with a hoodie from head to toe. They're wearing the little booties. They're wearing the plastic on, and they've got the mask or glass shields or whatever they're working with. We're having customers signing COVID forms and making sure that they stay at least 12 feet away from our installers while they're in the home. Because we are going throughout the home, whether we're doing TV service, phone service, internet, whatever it may be. And our installers have been instructed, if the people do not follow the guidelines, they are to immediately leave the household. Then we've got facilities within their service vehicles to allow them to be able to dispose of this equipment, clean themselves, make sure that they're fresh to get ready for the next call. That was a lot more, that was a little easier in April. In the hot months of the summer with the humidity, obviously that was a lot more trifling for them. So we made some adjustments to comfort levels. And I think as we, as a nation, became more comfortable with the way the Canadians were respecting COVID, and we realized that, okay, maybe you don't really need to be covered head to toe. You still need a fair amount of PPE gear. But as long as the people are staying away and you're not touching services, and as we became more educated, we were able to do the installs. I mean, that being said, we're probably about 60 to 75% this year up on the fiber side as far as sales are concerned. All of those being installs that are done in the actual person's residence. That's probably helped us gain business from our competitors as well, because they're still doing the self-install method. But it was definitely a headache. It was a concern. It was at one point, it's the awkward, are we ever going to move forward in business if we can't install customers? As much as we can build fiber out and build wireless broadband networks, if you can't get the service to the customer, your hands are tied. So we did our due diligence on that side, and we've been able to successfully move forward. Though it is a process we monitor on a daily and a regular basis. And we make sure that we check back with those customers after to make sure that they've not incurred COVID since, so we can make sure that the installs are done. Now, that being said, with more people coming back to work in phase 3 here in Ontario, I've now got the issue of dealing with staff that I'm sending home for 5 to 6 days for COVID tests because their child's been sent home from school with a sniffle, which I'm fine with, 100% fine with, but it's affecting business in a large way when on a weekly basis, I'm 10% down in my outside workforce or 20% down. Because somebody's got to sit at home and wait 6 to maybe even 14 days for a COVID test. So it's been different circumstances. We have very happily moved forward and met all of the challenges that we've had to face. being in telecommunications over 20 years, I've never had to deal with anything that was even close to this, resembled this. I'm hoping that the second projected wave that we're going through at the moment is the last of it. I have no idea. I can't foresee into the future. I'm going to work with the existing environment that we're in and plan accordingly based around that.
And for Sally and Matthew, I mean, obviously you have for us that live in urban centers, COVID, obviously major issue, but in terms of high-speed internet and broadband access, not really top of our concern list, if you will. It's been a problem that I'm guessing has been exacerbated in rural and indigenous communities with COVID. Has that changed the rhetoric in any way? Has it changed is it the willingness to run faster? Is it the apathy with what's going on? Like how is it a positive, or like how do we make sure we're staying on the right side of what this challenge is handing to us?
You want to go first, Sally?
Sure. Or you want me to go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Captain Matthew in your space capsule there. Yeah, Western James Bay, we were lucky because we were set up to work remotely to begin with. Our anchor institutions, that's where our revenue comes from. The problem we had was it was like everybody was running to the other side of the ship. I mean, our network is set up to serve the anchor institutions, the hospitals, the band offices. Now, it's not necessarily set up to serve the residential side, which is operated by a third-party company. So we had our leadership trying to work from home and calling us and saying, what can you do to help me with my wireless connection, etc. But I think, and I've said this before, I think that people that are in our industry, we've been handed an enormous responsibility, one that we didn't see coming. And I think that Dave will agree with me that it is a huge responsibility to get good information out to the leadership, to make sure that the people that are making the decisions are able to connect with other people that are making decisions. It's very, very difficult in a remote rural community to serve the people. We're just not set up to do that. We were set up to serve anchor institutions, not residential clients. So we're doing our best, and I'm pretty proud of how well our team has done to cope and deal with these things. But as far as COVID-19 is concerned, we're kind of on a ledge right now, and I think we're going to be on this ledge for a while. And we may be able to pull back from the ledge, but we always are going to have to be prepared to get out there on the ledge again. I think this is the first of a series of events that we're just going to have to be prepared for. And one thing that we haven't touched on at all is the whole issue of climate. We talk about poles, and maybe it makes more sense to run our infrastructure underground rather than above ground if possible. We haven't touched on the whole energy piece at all. So I guess that's a discussion for another day.
Sure. And then to echo both David and Sally's comments a little bit, and then kind of add a little bit more, we are in a situation in California, in a lot of places in the US, where all of the children are at home for school. There's nobody going to school physical. So the end of last school year and the beginning of this school year has all been virtual in San Diego County and Southern Riverside County of California. So where, maybe 1 in 6 households had access to our network on reservation, and in most places we are the only solution. There are a few that have, a cellular modem device that can plug into a router that can spread out through the house, but typically that's not how they use them. They typically use them and everybody accesses the device itself. Not a super robust way to do things when you have a parent or two parents working from home and one or two or three kids trying to work from home. That device is already oversaturated to be able to pull off the responsibilities, not to mention you've got 5 people fighting over audio space in your own house and disrupting each other. And there's a big expense for earphones and different things. It becomes a problem. And like David was saying, we had to get around, how do you install these homes during COVID? Our tribal leadership is like, you're not going in a tribal home, period. We're not going to be responsible for spreading COVID from home to home to home. And I really like David's method. I don't know that we have the resources to be able to do disposable gear at every installation. So we did a different approach. We reached out to each community and asked each community to provide somebody from their trusted utility staff that would be able to take a minimal direction. We pay that person per installation to be the person that goes in the house. They're trusted from the community, that they are following the rules of the tribe, not specifically of Tribal Chairmen's Association or CDC or whatever. They're following the rules of that tribe, and they're trusted by that community to be able to go into the tribal home on that reservation only. So each reservation we're working with provides a person or persons, and they go in the house and they have some cleaning supplies that we provide, and they do honestly 5 to 7 minutes worth of work. They plug it into the wall, they put it in a place that's not going to get trampled. We're not mounting anything during this timeline unless there's a shelf or something we can set things on. And then they're helping with the guiding the drilling the hole through the wall, passing the cable, and they're gone. So it's really pretty simple. We're pre-configuring all the components before they go into the home, and we pay that person $25 and to pay for their time. And we try to group installations together on the same reservation in the same day with 2 different teams, and that person can just hop from installation to installation and knock out their component of it in far less than, if we did 4 installations, it would be far less than 4 hours. It would probably be back to back, it would probably be an hour and a half or so if you did all 4. We time it right. So we did that as creativity. That therefore it's not on us. We're not in there. The tribe is responsible for that person. That's typically a tribal employee or a tribal trusted individual. They're managing that aspect of things. We have thought about waivers for doing things during COVID, but we didn't know if that was the right way to go. Tribes don't like signing stuff. Paper is, those agreements are always, historically bad. So we kind of went to the route like, hey, we trust your community to make its own decisions. So let's use your community to do this install. And we're feeding money into the tribe a little bit at a time. Another thing we're doing when we're building infrastructure, like we're building out towers or we're expanding opportunities and reservations, we're paying for their utilities crew to do the work. If they got to cut a road, if they're going to cut a pad for us, if we're going to pour a tower base, if we got to build a fence, normally we do a lot of that stuff ourselves. Right now, I'm reaching out to the tribe and asking if we go out and mark the ground when nobody's around, can you go out and do the work? And we'll pay for it. And so the tribe's getting an influx of cash to their community that they wouldn't normally see, because we usually take care of that stuff. We're also freeing ourselves up to do more things like installations and such as that utility work is being done, as that base level construction work is being done. And so I think that's how it's evolving. I do not believe that we are going to see normal again. I don't think we're going to see what we're looking at right now much longer than the summer of 2021, because I think once the vaccinations come into play, there will be some requirements from corporations to be able to function. And a certain percentage of people have to have that vaccination, et cetera, and we'll see if we get ahead of this thing. But I don't think normal looks like normal anymore. And I think that's good and bad. I think it's good that people now have the opportunity to work from home and stay in their community. I think it's bad that it may have destroyed some economies, and it may have destroyed some, vertical markets may not exist anymore, or may have to completely adapt to be something else.
I think we have about 8 minutes left if my calculations are correct. So wanted to, I don't think normal, or I don't think the way we've done things is going to work going forward. And on that note, I know from our perspective at CyberNB and some of the programs we've been trying to unleash hidden dollars with. We have this phenomenal thing in Canada called an ITB, industrial technology benefit, that gets accrued when companies have projects with the federal government. And there's this massive outstanding amount of money that industry is trying to find ways to spend so they can pay off their ITB obligations. And, you know, it seems again like another low-hanging fruit. If we can get ITB policy to change, it would seem like, you know, with triple P, like a public-private partnerships and working together, you know, if we can unlock some of these archaic policies and allow industry, not taxpayers, industry, to step up and put the dollars on the table, I think with the rural and Indigenous communities in Canada, knowing what kind of multiplier is on those dollars, I would have to guess that some of these, you know, new normals and changing of policies might unlock some real wind into the sail of progress here. I don't know, Sally, David, have you heard anything more, or what are your thoughts on the whole ITB strategy?
I think it's great if there's money out there like that. I've got a project in mind. I'm not sure whether I can get a lot of wind in the sail on it, but I'd like to build a dark fiber line east-west across Ontario over to the IXP in Winnipeg, so that we can, you know, our northern communities can access bandwidth from the States for a tenth of the price. Because right now the price of bandwidth is very, very high. High enough that, you know, we are talking to our the company that supplies us with bandwidth, and we're just saying, hey, look, you know, there is no way that we're going to be able to meet the federal benchmark if you are going to continue charging us what you're charging us for bandwidth. So, okay, so we can talk to them, but I think I think it would be a good idea to have more dark fiber in Northern Ontario for sure. I think that any new transmission line that goes in should automatically have fiber on it, even if it's, you know, not going to be used right away. Any new infrastructure built should have fiber running alongside it. I think we need more IXPs. I think we need to reduce our dependency on the IXP in Toronto. I think that we can save a lot of energy if we have, say, an IXP in Timmins and maybe another IXP in Thunder Bay, and make the entire network and the resources that we need, have them in Northern Ontario instead of this north-south thing, have an east-west vibe to it, I guess.
David, final comments towards the end of the session?
Yeah,
here?
I guess realistically, I mean, if I want to put it into final comments, we're in extremely difficult times. And as Sally had said, we've been handed a responsibility, which was the last thing I think we expected going into this calendar year within our communities. And the funding opportunities are far and wide right at the moment to be able to apply for, even though you can't depend on that for your success. It is the opportunity to take advantage of them where you can. We don't always have the human resources available to apply for everything that's out there. So we do have to pick and choose where we think our time is going to be best spent. Unfortunately, it takes something like a COVID-19 to be the realization that something like broadband internet is as essential as it is in a marketplace. I think that's sad to say to us as a human race and as a community, that it takes a virus for us to actually realize how something is so important on all levels, from business to education to health sectors. That being said, I think that, you know, the people on this call today, the people on the panel are here because they're interested in seeing the broadband movement become affordable for people, become speeds that are obtainable for people to use, that are applications that are necessary on the web today. And I think mutually, I think everybody's in there. I think The idea of profitability through this is not really the key. I think there's a great business opportunity, but I think we really need to lean forward with the community aspect of this. No matter which perspective we're coming from, everybody's got families, friends, business people that they're working with, know of acquaintances that are all hindered or in a better position because of broadband connectivity. And I just want to know that, Lakeland itself and me, myself, are playing a role in bringing that to the larger community.
Thanks, David. Matthew.
Yeah, so a couple things. I think what COVID has done for us is it isn't from the travel perspective something that is as obvious, like, oh, we needed broadband now that we have COVID. We've known this for a long time. I think it's just accelerated the efforts and hyper-focused the efforts to try to make this solution happen. And the other thing that it's done is it's brought visibility from external, from carriers and funders, foundations and such, and folks that are in sort of social responsibility roles and philanthropic roles within the community at large, a better visibility into how hard it's been in Indian country, in First Nations, to get access, because they thought they could fix it overnight once COVID fit. They're like, oh, hey, we'll just throw money at this and we'll fix it today. Sorry, we waited so long. We've heard you say this for the last 10 years, our bad. Here's a bunch of dollars. And I'm like, I don't need the dollars because I can't meet what you're trying to do. I can't take your dollars because I can't fulfill that in the fashion you think that this is fixable. There's no middle mile to that community. So building a network doesn't support the community at all because it can't get anywhere. There's missing fractional middle mile all over the United States. The lower 48 has 8,000 missing miles from fiber infrastructure to the reservation. And that's about 2 years old now, but still, it's still in the 7,000 plus range. I'm sure it's very similar in Canada in that same aspect, that middle mile never went to the tribe intentionally, because they built around obstacles when they built these fiber networks, because they didn't want to navigate another, sovereign government. They didn't want to navigate land they didn't understand. And they just went fast and went around it. So they went around lakes, mountains, canyons, and they went around tribes. So we see that it's very prominent in the US, that you watch the line just go, in a pattern right around the res. So I think it's really opened the eyes of those folks that they can't now turn around and solve that problem immediately. Even though they thought, oh yeah, we can do that.
I got in through.
So anyway, that's I think that's the perspective. The other thing is it's opened up really weird funding, right? So the federal government's trying to figure out how to do things. They're kind of tweaking some of their rules or overlooking some of their restrictions to allow funds to do a little bit different stuff than it used to, which is a good thing, because I think moving forward, they may adopt those rules as permanent. I think that opens up our opportunities moving forward. And we've seen a lot of private, goodwill coming out of just individuals and foundations during this timeline, realizing,
Exactly.
we have money, we have internet, we're sitting in a situation where we have no issues. I'm watching the news, or I'm watching Matt down here struggling, trying to get tribes connected during times of COVID. How do we help? And I've had a lot of reach out and a lot of engagement on that level, and it's been good. And I think corporations are doing the same thing. We've seen a lot of products start to flow that's free, a lot of, or discounted, or some sort of donation of technology. So I think it has shifted the environment a bit.
So I know we're at time. I will say I've really enjoyed this conversation today, and I thank you all for participating. I think if I leave with anything, I love the comment from Matthew, both the one that you kind of bookended this whole conversation with. The first one was, let's not bring leftover second-class solutions to a new challenge that needs to be dealt with. And the last one would be, let's all find a way to work together to make this thing a reality. So again, I thank you all. Sally, Matthew, David, real pleasure to talk to you all today. Franca and Lynn, thank you for having me in to moderate the panel. And with that, I hand the floor back to you.
Yeah, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks to all of you. Tyson, great job moderating. Really appreciate it. And Matt, thanks for taking the time away from your big conference there. Really
Headed
appreciate
right
it.
back.
Okay, take care.
So,
So I'd like to now introduce our next panel discussion. We're going to be looking at digital access as a potential solution for advancing diversity and inclusion. I want to give a special thank you to the Women's Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub for their support as presenting sponsor of this event and for putting together this panel for us. The panel is going to be moderated by Dr. Wendy Sucure, who is the founder of the Diversity Institute and professor at the Ted Rogers School of Management. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Wendy. If the panelists could all make themselves visible.
Thanks so much. And I'm sorry for crashing the meeting. I was having some technological problems. It's so great to see both you, Franca, and you, Lynn. It's been a long time, way too long. And Huda, I haven't seen you in ages, although Catherine and Jagris, I see you not often enough, but we're thrilled to have been able to help sponsor this event on behalf of the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, which is part of the Government of Canada's Women Entrepreneurship strategy. They committed to investing $5 billion to double the number of women entrepreneurs in Canada, and we're trying to help them do that by pulling together the networks and the organizations that support women entrepreneurs. And we're focusing, and I think this is important, we're focusing not just on the women's organizations, although lots of them do really good work. I was just on a panel with Pero from Northern Ontario, which is part of the Women Enterprise Organizations of Canada. We're really focusing on the mainstream organizations as well, the superclusters, the regional development agencies, the granting councils, those organizations that are investing in economic development, innovation, research, and commercialization more broadly. Because frankly, $5 billion is a drop in the bucket compared to the money that's being spent across the system. And so what we want to do is unlock access to that money as well, to support women, to support Indigenous entrepreneurs, to support racialized and Black entrepreneurs, those with disabilities, and so on. And it's a little more challenging than sort of setting aside a little bucket of money for Indigenous entrepreneurs or a little bucket of money for Black entrepreneurs and so on. But I think over time, it's an approach that will actually produce better results. We've done a lot of work to talk about, to look at the issues around the impacts of COVID particularly. And I have a little presentation I'll try to whip through before we go to the main event, which is the panel. And what I can say briefly is that before COVID, there was inequality. You've heard about some of the issues in northern communities in terms of access to broadband, and we'll talk more about that later. But of course, the inequalities went far deeper than that. They also had to do with, systemic discrimination and access to resources and so on, whether we're talking about Indigenous people or women or others. What COVID has done is made everything that was bad far worse. And the impacts of COVID have been most acute on those populations who were already facing challenges. If we look at women entrepreneurs, they're being crushed by the burden of unpaid work, simply crushed. And it comes out over and over again. 30% of women are considering leaving the workforce. And the impact of that on our overall economic development is absolutely massive. So I'm thrilled to be here. I think that there is a silver lining, and if there is a silver lining, it's that COVID has really made what seemed impossible possible. The kind of acceleration of investments in broadband, if they're done well, the dedicated supports to entrepreneurs across the spectrum, if they're done well, and of course, we now have, for example, the president of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce saying childcare is not a women's issue, it's an economic issue. It really, to me, represents ways in which we're rethinking the world. So let me see if I can master the technology, which is always my biggest challenge, and share my screen. The host has disabled screen sharing. So either you have to let me share it or you have to show my slides. Still says the host is disabled participant screen sharing.
He's working on it.
Okay, well, I'll keep blathering on, shall I? While we wait for the slides, because they're as much for me as they are for the audience. I'm at an age where if I don't have notes, I can't talk. Anyway, I think that the key thing when we think about the digital divide, and we think about the impact of COVID, and we think about diversity and inclusion, and the way in which they're linked, is that, as I said, many of the gaps that predated COVID have simply become more. And one of the things we were doing at the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, for example, was focusing on what the specific issues were around women entrepreneurs and some of the challenges that they were facing. And we know that one of the biggest barriers to women entrepreneurs is the unfortunate association between the notion of entrepreneurship and technology, which then becomes entrepreneurship and men. In general, if you ask, a room full of people, name 5 entrepreneurs, it's going to be Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, Elon Musk, if he's done something exciting recently, or Mark Zuckerberg. And that association is very strong, and it's also an association with technology, even though that we know that many entrepreneurs aren't developing technology, they may be using technology. And I like to point out that while Shopify is now Canada's largest company, it became Canada's largest company during COVID, not because they developed some new IP, as far as I know, or a new device. It was because people started using it. And if we don't have people using technology, we don't have innovation. So this idea that you invest in building new tools, new technologies, new applications, and so on, and somehow that will drive innovation and economic growth, is simply wrong-minded in my view. And I like to point out that Shopify is Canada's biggest company. And I also like to point out that Kylie Jenner became a billionaire at the age of 20 using Shopify, a Canadian platform, to sell her goop. And yet I'm quite confident that Kylie Jenner's company would not have been considered eligible, for example, for funding through the digital supercluster, because so much of our emphasis is on the companies that build the technology rather than figuring out how to advance adoption and inclusion. When we think about other issues that present barriers, I do think that we have to grapple with this association between technology and innovation, which I think creates distortions. It's not at all that I believe that we shouldn't be investing in artificial intelligence and trying to lead the way in that regard. But we have to understand that innovation is more than technology, and innovation relies on using the technology as well as making it. So let's see if I can master the art of screen sharing, because I am often challenged with technology. Even though I used to be a professor of information technology, which Catherine, at the school Catherine currently chairs, my family used to say that I was actually a professor of it, because they did not believe I knew anything about technology, given my inability to actually use it. So I want to be quick, and I've already covered a lot of this, but I think that we know that that COVID has accelerated digitization in business. We know that, for example, prior to COVID, 30% of members of the Ontario Chamber of Commerce didn't even have an internet presence. And so when we talk about high-end technology, we talk about artificial intelligence and robotics and data analytics and so on, we have to recognize there's a huge divide between the companies that are ready to use that and the companies that really didn't even have an internet presence. And when we look at the capability of companies in terms of upskilling and reskilling for this new world, we see a real divide between large companies, which are well equipped to both reskill their existing workforce, hire new personnel, as well as leveraging out contracts and so on, and smaller companies, which are less well equipped to do so, even though we know that tech is growing faster than anything else. And it's not just tech for tech's sake, it's the use of tech. We know, and I'm old, I've been around for 30 plus years working on technology. And what's so interesting to me is we've had the capacity to do online learning, distance learning, online health, e-government, many other E's for many, many, many years. And in spite of the availability of the technology, it wasn't being used. COVID changed that. I mean, we overcame decades of intransigence and opposition, and suddenly the barriers disappeared. But we know that the digital divide remains a problem. And we heard earlier about issues in rural and northern communities. We have to recognize it's not just an infrastructure issue. It's also about access to the actual tools. It's also about affordability. If you look at Toronto, for example, there are huge pockets where people are poor, they have higher rates of COVID, and they have less access to the internet, and they're less likely to be able to work from home. And you take all those factors together, and again, it reinforces how things, how our divides are getting worse. And we know that I don't need to talk about this, we know that there are big gaps. We know that affordability is not bad on an international basis, but for some, it's completely out of reach. I also wanted to just touch briefly on the issue of digital skills, because having the technology is one thing, being able to use it is another. And in spite of the preoccupation with coding, you know, we need to teach coding in utero now because everybody needs coding. But we have to remember that one of the impacts of AI is low code, no code, which is actually changing the demand for programmers. And when we look at the OECD results, for example, recently, where they say digital skills are high in demand, but we unpack it, what we see that only about 10% of companies are actually looking for those high-end engineers and coders. 75%, when they're talking about digital skill shortages, are talking about the ability to use Microsoft Office and spreadsheets. So we have to get more precise in our understanding of these things. We have to think more about, I think this point, which is the challenges are in rural communities, the inequalities are massive, but those aren't the only challenges. We have kids in downtown Toronto who are going to lose a whole year at least, maybe 2, of school because they don't have internet access. They don't have parents who can coach them. Remember that half of Toronto's population was born outside the country. and they are completely at a loss. We heard about the government investments. I was really glad to hear people challenge to move beyond words to action. And we also need innovative approaches to getting resources out to people and innovative approaches to upskilling and reskilling. And I've got my favorite projects, but I won't go on and on about them at this point. I just will say that I think we need to challenge the assumptions that you need a degree in computer science in order to have digital skills, in order to have a digital job, in order to drive transformation. And we also need to make sure that we do not leave an entire generation of youth behind because they don't have access to technology and the supports and already face challenges in graduating. And through the Women Entrepreneurship Knowledge Hub, we're trying to take advantage of the new tools that are available, not just to build capacity among different entrepreneurs, but also to provide new platforms for sharing what people need and what they have to offer. So in conclusion, and I really want to get to the panel, there are opportunities and threats. No question that COVID has actually moved us ahead years, light years, in terms of the rate of digitization, but that has also created more inequality. And we need to have a gender and diversity lens on everything that we do and make sure we have a broad definition of what we mean by infrastructure, what we mean by access, and what we mean by equality, frankly. So thank you so much for your patience. And I'd like to now turn to our panel. So I'm going to be very brief. Some of them have 50-page resumes, and I'm not joking, because they are so accomplished and so well established in the area. But I'll start with Catherine Middleton, who is a longtime colleague and professor and director of the Ted Rogers School of Information Technology. Her specialty is actually researching how we create a more access to technology and what some of the barriers are to enable people to participate fully in society. And she has many accolades to her name. Huda Idris is the founder and CEO of Dot Health, and she's way too busy to have made time for us today. So I'm really, really grateful for her. She has developed real-time health data, a real-time health data platform that's actually transforming the way people access and control their health information. She's an engineer graduate from the University of Toronto, and she's worked with some of Toronto's best known startups and consulted with governments, as well as really help drive innovation in this sector. And every time I hear her speak, I learn something new. Jagris Hodson is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair at Royal Roads University, and she looks at the impact of digital communication on participation for diverse groups. Her research has included many, many projects, including with GCI Canada, the Government of Canada, the Canadian Country Music Association, and many more. She's also one of Canada's leading experts on looking at abuse on the internet, online harassment, online hate, and so on, which are also part of the dark side of digitization that I hope we'll be able to talk to. So let me start by asking Catherine if you can kick it off. I tried to give a kind of overview of many of the issues I know that you've worked on for many, many years. But can you tell us where you think we are today? What's driving the next steps? And what do we really have to focus on in order to address the impediments to universal broadband and high-speed internet across Canada?
Thanks, Wendy. So I think there are many impediments, and the impediments are different for different groups. They're different in different parts of the country. So those of you who were on the call earlier heard the rural and remote connectivity issues, heard a lot of issues there. There fundamentally, I think it comes down to three broad categories. So there is still in many parts of the country, there is still simply not the infrastructure available. So you want a broadband connection, you can't get it. It doesn't matter how much you're willing to pay, it's just not there. There are many, many programs that are addressing this. The federal and provincial governments have recently announced a lot of money, so that's positive, but there's still a long way to go on that, and I can build on that a little bit, but I'll give a high-level overview first. Affordability is still really an issue. So for those people who do have service, it is not always affordable. One of the challenges in Canada is that we don't have great up-to-date data on many aspects of our digital economy. But if we look at the US, which is similar to us in many ways, we see from a April 2020 survey, so just at the beginning of the pandemic, 52% of lower income Americans were worried about paying their broadband bills, about the same number worried about paying their cell phone bills. I suspect that these same concerns exist in Canada. So that's an issue. And one of the solutions to that has been to offer subsidized services, but they're often not at the same quality that you would get if you were able to just go out and buy your own service. So that's an impediment as well. There is also the issue of sustainability of programs. So something like the lending of wireless hotspots, which many libraries do, which is a great initiative in many ways, but they have, like many things at the library, they have a due date. So after 6 months with the Toronto Public Library hotspot, it's deactivated. So what happens at that point? So there isn't always a sufficient sustainability plan to back up initiatives that on the surface look quite promising. There's related to that, it's not just internet access, it's also devices. So I recently was able to learn more about what the school boards in Toronto are doing in terms of providing support to students who didn't have access. And it is, while some students needed internet access, by far and away the much larger demand is for devices because they are not able, they don't have a computer, it's not possible to do schoolwork on a cell phone. So what they needed from their school boards was actually not an internet connection. They needed some kind of computing device so that they could participate in their classes. Let me see, just looking at my notes. I think the other issue, and Wendy, you touched on it, and I'll make fun of you for a moment because we are friends of long standing. So I think many of us have been in Zoom calls where we can't figure out how to share our screens and so on. We have been working with this technology for decades. So if you think of somebody for whom this is a second language, for whom the devices are new, for whom this is a little bit confusing, it's just not accessible. And the Canadian Internet Use Survey from 2018, the public data was just released recently. And so just looking at that, and I'm looking off to the side of my screen, 60% of Canadians who said they were internet users said they had used word processing software in the past year. So that means 40% weren't even using word processing software. Only 40% had done PowerPoints. Now, you can probably get through life without doing PowerPoints, but again, it speaks to that that literacy. So just to sum up, I think as we've known for a very long time, the issues have been here. We're making small progress. There's the infrastructure issue, there's the affordability issue, there's the access issue. And while there are many, many initiatives to address them, I think one of our major problems is that much of it is still patchwork. And so it's hard to find a solution that pulls together all of the impediments and addresses them.
I think that's a super, super important point because it is, and we see this across the board with programs that are available even to support entrepreneurs, for instance. Pathfinding is one of the real challenges, and I do think it's important to underscore the issues around literacy and language and just sophistication. You know, when we need things, we know where to go. We have a certain level of privilege, and lots of other people don't know where to start. So I think that is a really important point to continue to poke on. And Jagris, that sort of leads into the work that you've been doing, again, for many years, thinking about what the implications are around diversity and inclusion and some of these issues. We've heard some, but I know that there's a lot of other things that we have to unpack. So over to you.
Thanks, Wendy. And yeah, I think both you and Catherine in your remarks set up really well this digital divide that exists between people who are able to get both broadband access and access to devices and those people that can't. And those numbers often fall among the lines of race or culture or new immigrants versus more established people in Canadian society. And so very important to look at the intersectional ways that some people are disadvantaged by that lack of access, whether it's because it's an Indigenous community in a rural area, or whether it's because it's a new immigrant that maybe has a cell phone but no computer access. We see some sharp diversity lines that occur that mean that some people can more easily work or do school from home and others can't. If we look at the gender divide, for example, as you mentioned in your remarks, Wendy, we do see in Canada, but also North America generally, women are more likely to drop out of the workforce and take on some of that childcare or elder care. And as COVID allows some people to work from home or not others, it also impacts women who tend to be maybe in the service industries, or people of color who tend to be in the service industries and can't work from home, have to go into work, and then are more likely to be exposed from COVID. So they're definitely not feeling the advantages of this digital shift. Now, looking at it, as you alluded to, from an angle of online harassment, the data gets even more troubling. So women are more likely to be victims of what Emma Jane has termed economic vandalism, in that if they need to use digital tools in the course of their work, and then they experience online harassment, they're more likely to then be unable to, for safety reasons or psychological reasons, benefit from the use of those tools after incidents of harassment. So they're more likely to be subject to sexual remarks, online stalking, and other forms of online behavior. And the platforms don't usually step up and help unless the person experiencing harassment is very high profile. And you can see harassment of sorts even being supported by some members of the extreme right wing, in both the US and Canada. And so it becomes an issue where people are almost encouraged to lash out against those who they don't agree with. And that can be a huge issue for women in technology related fields. So, in your presentation, Wendy, you talked about how, well, technology isn't just coding, it's also Word or Excel skills. And that is true. But if we consider coding and teaching women to code, you often find that women get into the workplace and they're designing games or they're working in science, and they are unwillingly open themselves up to harassment from these male-dominated fields. So if we don't address our policies towards how people are treated online, if we don't address the fact that these platforms actually make a lot of money out of harassing speech because it gets a lot of engagement, then we are excluding many people who maybe even have access through their devices and through broadband, but get online and are driven off. And so I think that's a very real issue that is often not talked about when we talk about access to technology and we talk about COVID and the digital shift.
Thanks for raising that. I think it's critically important. And I confess I disengaged from Twitter entirely because I couldn't take the constant harassment every time I tried to make a statement you know, social inclusion or diversity. So I think it is a real problem, and I think I was smiling because I think you're absolutely right that the way in which these problems are dealt with does again have a lot to do with your status. And if you are high profile and you are powerful, they take these things far more seriously than if you're not. So, and we'll come back to you, Jagris, because I'd also, you know, you've done a lot of, you've spoken a lot as well about issues around inclusive design and the implications there. So we'll cycle back as well. But Huda, so pleased you could join us. And, you know, I think it's so timely because I've heard you talk about your entrepreneurial journey before, but I wonder, I don't think we've spoken since COVID. So I wonder if you can, for the folks on the call, maybe give a bit of a summary of your journey and then talk to us about what you've seen as a result of COVID, both in terms of your business, but as well just with respect to digital transformation.
For sure. And really excited to be here. And thanks for having me, Wendy and the crew. I really appreciate it. A bit of background, you know, I kind of come at this from a perspective of a business owner and a business owner that runs a technology company. And back to Jagris's point about women getting into coding, the whole reason I am an entrepreneur and got into, you know, sort of the engineering track and became, you know, a technology entrepreneur is because I got into coding really early on. And it was because I had access to the internet and to computers. So I grew up in a beautiful city called Jeddah. It's in Saudi Arabia. There's a map behind me, actually. I didn't plant it. It's always been there. And, you know, for me, getting into programming really early on opened up this like incredible horizon of all the various businesses that I could approach. And I think, you know, even if we look at the numbers of new businesses that are created and what percentage of those businesses are either technology businesses or technology enabled businesses, it's quickly reaching the 100% mark. Like there is no business that sort of exists, you know, or minimal amount of or number of businesses that exist without an online presence, maybe without their listing on Google. Like if you start to think about it from that perspective, very, very few of them have no sort of technology connection at all. And I think that's really important because when we talk about accessibility, both of, you know, hardware, of course, because you need a laptop to be able to program, you know, will we get to a point where we can program on our cell phones? Yeah, of course we will. Like that is a very natural sort of next step progression. But at the moment, we do require certain prereqs, you know, are still required in order to get online. But then I think, you know, of course, the accessibility of internet and Canada continues to be so expensive. And, you know, people who are familiar with my politics recognize that I'm always talking about how Canada is like a country of oligopolies. We've just like accepted the fact that we're going to have three big players in everything because we're a small enough market. But if you look at, you know, a small enough market, Canada's what, 37 million people. And, you know, I kind of resent having to use this example, but California is 35 million people, right? And if you look at the number of startups that start there and how much competition you can actually build in purely that one state in a country that's not that far from us, it's weird to think, well, why can't an entire government think almost like the state of California and think of their own market as, you know, expansive and wonderful and a gateway to other parts of the world? There's nothing to say that internet businesses can't, sure, start in Canada, but then kind of grow beyond the Canadian borders because they're online, and obviously they can. And Wendy gave a great example of Shopify. There's a bunch of other companies, some of which, you know, I've personally been involved in, like Wattpad or Well Simple or Wave, who are all Canadian companies, but serve populations, most of whom live outside of Canada. So I think that's, you know, something to pay attention to. And I think women kind of get the double whammy because they get, you know, like reduced access to a lot of pure hardware, reduced access or reduced earnings leads them to not have as great, you know, access to the best internet available. And then on top of it, when they try to start businesses, they like get like a tiny minuscule percent of all funding available to actually grow their business. So it's just like, it's a terrible day and time to be a woman. And I think the internet inaccessibility kind of piles that on, definitely.
Can you just, I'm just going to push a bit harder. Can you talk a little bit about your business itself and what it does and what the impact has been.
Absolutely. So I run a wonderful organization called .health. We started in 2017, and what we've built is a real-time health data platform, like Wendy mentioned at the top of it. What that means is the status quo at the moment is if you're getting any type of care, you could be getting a prescription, a referral from a doctor, you could be getting a lab requisition form. All of that information currently travels by way of fax machines between doctors' offices and hospitals. What DOT does is it kind of disintermediates that transaction and has all that information flow through in real time digitally. So every individual Canadian has access to their own information, yes, but on top of it, they can also use sort of the .health rails, we call them, to move their own information across, provincial borders, across institutional sort of silos, and have access to it all at the same time. And, we started this business in 2017. Sure, internet was relatively widely available, but we actually wouldn't be able to do this without the internet. That is such a prerequisite of what we actually do, and the speed matters a lot. So, we transact so many pieces of individual data to people clean across the country. There are literally .health users in Nunavut and Northern Ontario, but also all parts of BC and Alberta and Ontario, which are of course some of our largest markets, all across the Atlantic provinces. And if you think about how there's of course equity when it comes to healthcare, and it's built, there's so many layers. You of course need internet access. You need on top of it all of the piping and plumbing that we're building. But if you don't even have internet access, you actually wouldn't be able to, in some future version of Canada, be able to access basic things like care. And I think we're seeing that even with virtual care, which we don't operate in directly, but work with a lot of virtual care partners, like the Maples and the Dialogues and the EQ Cares of Canada. You wouldn't be able to get care if you don't have access to the internet, which is a really scary thought. And when we think about accessibility, I think we have to think about what alternatives there are.
And has the transformation of healthcare in terms of, I made fun of the universities for transitioning overnight, but I was chair of Women's College Hospital. I'm past chair, and our digital adoption strategy over the last 2 years was kind of compressed into 2 weeks. Right. Has that had an impact on your business? What have you seen in that regard?
Huge, and I think I tried not to say a ton about it publicly, just because I think COVID's a really difficult time for most businesses, but it's not a difficult time for .health, right? So we've of course had our biggest quarter this last quarter. We've just had record number of sort of engagements on the platform because the alternatives are harder. So the alternative to .health is a health records employee walking into a health records department having to fax a piece of paper over, and the sort of need for immediate test results, the need for immediate sort of referrals is so much higher. It's literally overnight we saw our numbers go way up. We thought there was an error in our database management software, because it was how can that be? And it was almost the moment the lockdown was initiated, it was almost literally the next day. So I think it has had, positive impact in moving people in this direction for sure. I still think there's so much work still to be done. It's really, to Catherine's point earlier, health data, internet connectivity is patchwork. Yes. Health data access is so patchwork. Oh my God, we just it's just so disparate. Hospitals won't talk to another hospital. Literally a department won't talk to another department in the same institution. So there's a lot of sort of bridge building that needs to happen, but we've honestly had a really great, time.
But your point, and I'm glad you made that point, because as I said it earlier, innovation may be driven by technology, but technology is insufficient. And if we look at what the barriers have been to e-health, to online learning, to government services and so on, for the most part, it has not been the availability of technology. I can show you quotes from 30 years ago where people said, electronic health records are going to transform healthcare. The barriers, especially in Canada, are institutional. They're what people are getting rewarded for. You know, until fairly recently, 70% of doctors felt that patients should not have access to their health records. So those impediments, which we see in healthcare, I think translate right across the system. And the only other thing that I wanted to flag is the other thing that we see is many, and I don't know if this may not be true of you, Huda, but many health tech startups go south of the border before they do anything in Canada, because barriers in Canada in terms of the procurement policies and so on are so Byzantine and prehistoric. And one of the things that I also see coming out of the COVID discussion is people starting to talk about, in spite of all the free trade agreements and the new trade agreements, but thinking about repatriating our supply chain in some critical areas and starting to think about using procurement as a preferential tool to help grow Canadian businesses again. Because let's face it, we've lost a lot of our infrastructure in terms of brilliant minds and brilliant business ideas, because it's just too hard. If it's so hard to get into a hospital down the street and it's much easier to go south of the border, well, guess what happens? So I do think that's another dimension of what we're talking about. But back to you, Catherine, I wonder if you wanted to dig in a bit deeper around what you were talking about with respect to some of the barriers, and maybe especially around skills and what you're seeing with respect to trends in upskilling and reskilling and ways in which we think about digital skills in the current environment, and some of the stuff that you've been doing at Ryerson.
I think the example that we've just been talking about, which is access to health information, is a nice entree point for people into the digital environment. So often when you survey people who don't have internet access, the reason they say they don't have internet access is they're not interested. There's some research that suggests that's a proxy for affordability and other things. And I think most of the experience that we've all had is when you find that point of interest, it turns out that people are actually fundamentally interested in internet access. They just didn't know perhaps why it was important to them. So I think you can take things like .health, like other pieces that are crucial to our everyday existence. If you think of some of the intersectionality, although we don't have information in, say, the public statistics around internet access that looks at measures of healthcare, we know in general, when you talk about maps overlaying, that people who are lower income, less well educated, and so on, are also more likely to have poorer health outcomes. So for that population in particular, being able to gain agency and control over health records can be fundamentally important to being empowering. So there are successful literacy programs that take a fundamentally different approach than teaching people how to use PowerPoint and teaching people how to use Excel. They are looking at empowering people by understanding it. What is it that you need to do or that would be valuable for you? And I think it also then potentially changes the ways that we think about devices. So while yes, at the moment, if you're going to school, it's really hard to do that on a cell phone. We shouldn't assume that only having a cell phone is actually not a good thing. The focus shouldn't be entirely on getting laptops and desktop computers to people. I think we need to recognize the power in devices and recognize that, again, there are particular sets of solutions that will work for one part of a population that will not work for another. But let's look at the places where we can make those wins. So let's, again, going back to a health app, whether it's Huda's or another, if you learn how to use that, then you're going to have the confidence and the understanding to do other things on that mobile device. And then that opens up a lot of the world for you. So I think there are ways of reframing the question of what digital skills is about by focusing more on understanding the individual's needs rather than on that preconceived list of things that you see in a survey, which is, do you know how to share files? Do you know how to upload? That kind of thing. Focus on what, you know, the old, I don't remember which company, but where do you want to go today? It's that kind of thing.
You know, and it's interesting you raise this because I know that we're really preoccupied with high-speed broadband and it's critically important to get it in place. But in the short term, I think there are lots of opportunities to learn from examples in emerging economies where, you know, I found it ironic. We're teaching English on iPhones to people in refugee camps. And yet our English language training in Canada is abysmal. You know, 50% of it is completely wasted. People would learn more English if they drove Uber than they do sitting in classrooms. And we haven't really, you know, in some ways, some of the emerging economies are far ahead of us in sort of flexible, adaptable, low cost solutions to things that, you know, why can't we let people work and teach them English on their cell phone in their breaks in little chunks and give them tools that allow them to translate in real time, or et cetera, like we have, in my view. And it runs the gamut of digital skills as well as, you know, essential skills like language training, where we're really stuck in certain boxes. And I teach at a university. You know, Catherine, I think you'll agree, I've been there a lot longer than you, but we haven't fundamentally altered the way in which we teach in the 30 years I've been at Ryerson. We're now doing stuff online, but it's still very much structured exactly the same way as the old ways. You know, it's instead of a 3-hour once a week class, it's, you know, maybe an hour or whatever. And I think we're still a far distance from really thinking about how we use the technology, as you said, to respond to people's needs. Jagris, I know you've talked previously about some of these, some of the dangers of, not the dangers, but the challenges around assuming that technology will make things better and fairer and more equitable, as opposed to just embedding things that are not very good. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. We can start with, you know, Uber is a great example, right? So Uber, in paying its drivers and developing an algorithm for, you know, how the person should pay, has developed sort of a surge pricing algorithm, which seems to make sense neutrally on paper, right? The idea being if there's more demand for Ubers, then the price will be higher. Okay, no problem. But, you know, the result of that has actually been a gendered divide in driver payments between women and men, in that women who work for Uber make less than men. Now, why would this be, right, with a neutral algorithm? It's specifically because a lot of those times where the surge pricing is applied are times when women don't feel safe driving alone, right? So middle of the night, after the bars close with a lot of drunk patrons, you'll be more likely to get male drivers who will benefit from the surge pricing than the women who, you know, might be driving in between, you know, picking the child up from school or daycare and, you know, dropping them off and that sort of thing. So, you know, that's one example of how a system that on paper is supposed to be designed to be the most fair still disadvantages diverse groups. And part of the reason why this keeps occurring is specifically because we don't have a lot of diverse groups designing these apps. We don't have a lot of people who can sort of say, well, hey, actually, if we, you know, only pay extra during these times, then that might advantage this group over the others. I wouldn't myself, you know, feel safe driving at that time, for example. And this carries on, you know, into healthcare as well, right? So Apple Health, for example, didn't have period tracking until after 2015. Even though, you know, Apple Health was being widely used before that point. And it's because the generally male developers of Apple Health didn't think that period tracking was, you know, really useful to understanding your health. Now, any woman, you know, will say, well, actually, it's a pretty big indicator of a lot of things. And, you know, I think this continues for other diverse groups as well who don't have a seat at the development table. And so things get missed. And we see it, in health, we see it in commerce, we see it in predictive policing. And a lot of these problems could be solved or at least mitigated, I think, by having a more inclusive environment for many different people to come to the table and help to develop these technologies. But unfortunately, even if the pipeline is there and diverse groups are being invited in, at the school level through education or other types of training, they often get into these workplaces and still feel excluded. And then you see a drop off there. So inclusive design isn't as easy as just inviting people to the organization. The whole culture of these organizations needs to be examined and addressed.
Thanks very much. And before we go to, we've got a couple of questions in the chat, which I want to get to before we wrap up. But I just wondered, Huda, from your experience with .health, any observations on the gender and diversity issues in terms of, technology access and use that you see?
Yeah, I think for us, what's really interesting, and we're a little bit of a reverse of a lot of organizations, because often the people in families typically who are taking care of a healthcare sort of plan for anybody often tend to be women. So even when it comes to the care of the elderly or care of parents, it's often the women who are sort of in charge. So we actually have more women than men on the platform. It's pretty close, but there are more females sort of engaged in at least our area. Whereas if you look at, any sort of fintech platform, it'll be the reverse. There's always more sort of, access and desire and engagement from men. And I think what's become very apparent to us, similar to what Jaggers is mentioning with Apple Health, what's become really apparent to us is there are a lot of use cases that no one really designs for. So when you look at the type of health data that comes down the pipe from any one place, it's rarely, if ever, looking at certain formats that would be better suited, for example, for women going through fertility treatments, for women who are pregnant. Like there's so few platforms that will cater to that gender, I'll say, compared to, everyone sort of does like lab acquisition. There's a ton of sort of like reminders, et cetera, for things like prostate checks. But, when it comes to sort of mammograms in the same like event calendar, so to speak, they're just not up to speed. Same thing with vaccine scheduling. So I think we've seen stuff that's like very specific to healthcare and healthcare data specifically, versus like pure access. And I think the access is really the difference we've seen is there's obviously a huge sort of urban rural divide when it comes to, just basic access to like basic health services. And we haven't seen a huge gender split in that data.
Okay, great. Thanks. So what I'd like to do is shift now to some of the questions that are popping up in the chat. We may not get to all of them in the next, I think, 3 minutes that we have left. We'll pick off a couple, but I'm sure the panelists will be happy to follow up with people. So if you do have questions, stick them in the chat. So I'm going to go to Alan Cherwinski, who says, the audience for an economic focus on upskilling digital skills can be distinct and distracting from the needs for digital literacy in the context of limited text and numeracy skills. And it's more of a comment, I guess, than a question, but I think it's absolutely right. Anyone on the panel want to add a comment on that one?
The only thing I'll say is that it again points to the need for an integrated approach and data that doesn't just look at one slice of things. So the internet use data, digital literacy data, is separate from data that would give us more information on basic literacy and numeracy skills. So it's hard to bring these things together to paint that entire picture.
I think that's a really good point. And I wanted to just give a very small anecdote. We launched a program like very quickly in response to the needs of one of our partner organizations, which serves specifically Caribbean and African youth and tries to develop their leadership skills. And it's very clear that tutoring, for example, is a class-related service. So my kid gets a tutor. The tutor may not teach her, but the tutor helps her be successful because I got money and I want my kid to do well at school. There's huge socioeconomic status things related. So we launched an online tutoring thing with a number of the teachers' colleges providing free access, and it was a big success. But one of the things that just killed me was we were getting feedback from parents, and one of the parents said, this has been transformational, it's helped this, it's helped that. My English skills are not so good. Could I participate as well? And I think that, yeah, kills me. But I think that one of the really important things we need to do is recognize that distinction between essential skills, which are really the platform on which we can build everything else. I think we have time for one more question. This is directed at Catherine. I understand the most recent CIUS switched from online first data collection. Do you think lower income and those with limited no access are underrepresented, or perhaps this was accounted for in the design?
So I've just been looking this up as we speak. It looks like there is still a computer-assisted telephone interview piece of it in the survey. So if you go, and I posted an answer, but I realized I only posted it to panelists. So I'm going to post it again to everyone. That gives the link to the survey methodology discussion. So they're certainly aware of it. But I don't know practically whether the steps they've taken are sufficient, because yes, it's obviously a concern to survey people online about whether they have internet access.
And I've heard you talk about that before. I'll sneak in one more question. This is to you, Jagris. What is inclusive design?
Thanks, and I did answer this in the Q&A chat, but for the benefit of everybody who didn't see my Q&A answer, I would say that we can't just design for, what we get the signals from the algorithms as the majority of people, because then we lose those cases where diverse bodies or minorities could really benefit from the technology. So inclusive design means looking at those minority cases, those end node cases, and saying, we want to design for them too, bringing them into the fold, finding out what those cases are that may not happen 90% of the time, but might happen 30, 40% of the time, or even 10 or 20% of the time, and say, you know what, I want to design for those people too, because I want my technology to be accessible, usable, and valuable to a broad segment of the population. So basically, inclusive design means bringing everybody in.
Yeah, and it's interesting because some of the new video-based platforms have things like annotation built in and others don't. And I'll just, one last anecdote, and then we do have to wrap, is that, we did a study of barriers to people with disabilities, the full range, people with physical disabilities, cognitive difference, and so on. And while one can argue that COVID has exacerbated problems for some people with disabilities, especially, there are arguments that mental health overall has really been compromised. The two big things that many people with disabilities said would really be transformational in terms of their ability to work more effectively were flexible work hours and the ability to work from home. And in some ways, COVID again has created this environment where we're starting to question and challenge and reconsider things that we thought were impossible. And certainly, telework, again, we've talked about it for 30 years. Most of the impediments have been that managers don't believe you're working if they can't see you. And so some of that has also really, I think, been transformed. So I could go, I thought this was really interesting, and I'm really grateful to all our panelists, but our time has come to an end. And respecting everybody else's time, I just wanted to say thank you very much to the Internet Society for organizing today, and all of you for joining us in what I think was a really interesting discussion.
Thank you so much, Wendy. This was really fantastic. Thank you, Catherine, Jagris, and Huda. Your insights were amazing. I'm going to share your presentation, Wendy, with all of the registrants. And thank you again to WEKH for your support of this event. We couldn't do it without you. So thank you very much. And for all of the attendees, thank you for joining us. I hope to see you again tomorrow at 1 p.m. for the second day of the third annual Digital Access Day. Thank you very much,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Miss you all.
Yes.
Miss you.
In person next time.
Oh, please.